comes crucially into play then in the following year, in 1873, when Schliemann makes the most dramatic discovery, or alleged discovery, of his entire campaign at Troy. So work began again early on in February 1873, when the weather at Hisarlik was still freezing. His wife Sophia then joined later in mid-April. Early on the western side of the hill, the team found more Greek inscriptions, and Schliemann again haggled with Calvert over the price for full ownership of these inscriptions. And then he found more which he simply kept and never mentioned to Calvert or anybody. On the eastern side, in the enormous deep trench that's being extended further into the hill, the team found many layers of building and destruction, especially by fire. Schliemann wanted to believe, again, that the second layer from the bottom, which seemed to represent great wealth and splendor, represented Homeric era Troy. But now they're seeing there are so many layers from so many ages, everything is thrown into uncertainty. The team found many fragments of skeletons and of nearby objects, such as copper vessels, weapons, and trinkets. So it would seem that these were probably burials with grave goods. But this presented a problem for Schliemann, because in the Iliad, the Trojans do not bury their dead, they cremate them. And so it seems Schliemann misreported these finds, saying that they had found 2 complete skeletons wearing war helmets, thus implying that these remains were casualties of war or of the sacking and destruction of the city, and hence could be fitted into the Homeric story of Troy. In April, they began cutting into the western slope of the hill, facing towards the plain and the sea. And they found a long, sloping, paved ramp climbing up the hillside from the west and leading into a large fortified gateway, which Schliemann identified with the so-called Scaean Gate in the Iliad, in front of which much of the action of the war took place. Further up and northward within the walls, they found the foundations of 2 large buildings, with the later one superimposed on top of the older one. And Schliemann identified the older building underneath as the Palace of Priam, the king of Troy in the Iliad. In early May, Sophia learned that her father back in Athens had died, so she left and returned to Greece. But Schliemann and the team kept cutting the western trench further into the hill until it met up with the trench that had been cutting into the hill from the north. It happens that his wooden cabin was nearer the corner of this intersection of the 2 trenches, and it was now perched precariously right over the edge of this massive intersecting trench network. On the morning of May 31st, Schliemann was in the large trench, looking at the remains of the western defensive wall, which was still embedded here into the side of the trench. While looking at the wall, he saw glints of metal objects, and he started trying to dig them out of the wall with a knife. Now, in a book which he published a few years later, Schliemann gave an account of precisely what happened next and what he found, which has become famous and today is perhaps notorious, still known as one of the most dramatic and iconic and now controversial scenes in the entire history of archaeology. So this is what Schliemann described in his book called Troy and Its Remains. Quote, "In excavating this wall further and directly by the side of the palace of King Priam, I came upon a large copper article of the most remarkable form, which attracted my attention all the more, as I thought I saw gold behind it. On the top of this copper article lay a stratum of red and calcined ruins, from 4 3/4 to 5 1/4 feet thick, as hard as stone, and above this again lay the above-mentioned wall of fortification, which was built of large stones and earth, and must have belonged
Takes
to an
two
early
to
king
tango.
after the destruction of Troy.